Okay. Welcome to everyone today. Welcome to the panelists and welcome to the audience. I'm Michelle Williams and I'll be the moderator for today's Democratic Marxism webinar. So this year marks the SACP's 100th anniversary. And over these past 100 years, the Communist Party has played an enormously important role in understanding the complexities and uniquenesses of South Africa's political economy, as well as in the struggle. It played a crucial role in the struggle against colonialism and apartheid. Ideas such as non-racialism and colonialism of a special type help make sense of the unique South African conditions, but also, especially non-racialism, the concept also provided an aspirational universal of non-racialism that captured the imagination of progressives around the world. Its history, the SACP or the SACP's history, is also chock full of courageous and selfless people from all races, African, Indian, colored, and white, and varied class locations. And all of these people finding their common humanity in the struggle to overcome racist and exploitative colonial and apartheid systems. There were, of course, mistakes along the way, but the Communist Party for many years seemed to have always find ways to correct itself. Few political parties, I would argue, can claim such histories. In the post-apartheid period, the SACP was poised to be an important force in the democratic South Africa. It was a period of creative thinking, organizational renewal, and enormous hope. It captured the imagination of many young people, and it seemed to offer a home to be part of building democratic, non-racial, non-sexist, socially and economically just South Africa. In the 1990s, many South Africa's most talented young people found their political home in the SACP. The analyses and ideas of the SACP during the 1990s were exciting and captured all of this kind of burgeoning, hopeful moment. Yet today, the SACP is a shadow of its former self. Its voice is virtually absent, even in this moment of crisis in our country. Its leaders are in cabinet, parliament, provincial and local governments, thus have access to the levers of state power. This begs the question, how did the SACP descend from being one of the most credible voices on the left to a meek organization who vacillates from populist rhetoric to dogmatic Marxism-Leninism? Our three speakers today have intimate knowledge and experience of this history. All were among the talented young people that were attracted to the SACP in the 1990s. They all believed in the best of what the SACP could be and the role it should play in society. They moved to Johannesburg to be part of it. They also share the painful experience of being expelled or suspended from the SACP. For Vishwas and Mazibuko, it was their fierce opposition to the SACP's opportunistic support of Zuma that ultimately got them expelled. For Zico, he's been suspended for his fierce independence and unwillingness to jump on any bandwagons. So Zico is a longtime trade unionist and still remains a member of the SACP, but I think he's still suspended. He can clarify, but I think he might be on an eternal suspension, but he's still a member. Mazibuko is an independent scholar, activist, practitioner. He's rooted in the rural villages near Keiskammahoek in the Eastern Cape, where he comes from, his beloved Rabula. And he was, in the 90s or early 2000s, he was the deputy provincial secretary and the former of Gauteng and the former spokesperson of the SACP at the national level. He was also a leader of the Young Communist League. Vish is an associate professor of international relations at Wits University, and he's also the chairperson of the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. In the 1990s and 2000s, he was an activist and an activist in the SACP, especially in the 2000s, and he was a former provincial secretary of the SACP in Gauteng. Zico is also, I think, a former provincial secretary of the SACP in Gauteng. Okay, each speaker is going to have 15 minutes. And in the interest of time, I'd like to ask participants if they could write their questions into the chat. If you can't do that, then we'll take some, but just to make sure that we have enough time for a nice discussion afterwards. It helps us if you can write your questions in the chat. Okay, so the order is going to be Zico, and then Mazibuko, and then Vish. All right, Zico, can you unmute yourself and turn on video if you can? I'm going to let you know. Michael is not going to have his video on while he speaks because of his connectivity issues. But Zico, if you could turn on your video and your unmute. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Comrade Michelle. Good afternoon to all of you, comrades. I won't turn my video, my camera on because it's upside down. I don't want Marxism to be upside down. I don't know what's wrong with it. Just one point before I start. Yes, I'm still a member, and Comrade Michelle and all of you comrades, I'm no longer suspended in the SACP. I was suspended pending the outcome of my disciplinary hearing, which did happen, and then there was sentence. So I became active soon after my suspension was lifted, once the sentence was passed on me. Today, comrades, as we are reflecting during the centenary of the SACP, I just want to remember 3 comrades who had a very positive impact on me politically during my years in the SACP and also as an activist in the labor movement. Comrade Vanguard Mkhosana, who was once a DG in the labor department during Mdladlana's era. That comrade was also at some point an educator in the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, in SARU rather, in the South African Railway and Harbour Workers Union, a predecessor to SADAW. That comrade took theoretical issues very seriously because, amongst others, he was one of the leading members of the then South African Congress of Trade Unions. He, together with Comrade Zola Zembe Achisbeko, used to engage some of us in SADAW, some of the youngsters in SADAW, telling us to write about the history of the struggle in this country, and they used to contribute a lot to publishing books about the role of SACP, the then South African Congress of Trade Unions, in the class struggle in this country. By the way, one Marxist in the 80s once argued that SACP was better theoretically equipped in terms of the struggle for socialism in this country than the South African Communist Party. But that's a debate for another day. The second comrade is Comrade Thembi Masondo, a Marxist shop steward who was a member of our branch, the Joburg Central branch of the SACP, and also a member of SACAW. Lastly, of course, last but not least, my own late chairperson, Comrade Ngospendule Kholisile, chairperson of the party here in Gauteng. He would have been part of this debate. In fact, one of the issues I will be raising was very close to him, was very passionate about the SACP contesting elections. He used to like citing from Lenin on the question of on communists acting as tribunes of the people in parliament, not being there to make legislative compromises with this or that bourgeois party, let alone being there for career purposes. But then, comrades, back to the question itself. I will just be short because I expect lots of issues to be surfaced during the discussion. So what I will do now, I will just try to flag some issues so that comrades are livened up for the discussion or debate that must follow thereafter. The first point, comrades, to make on this topic of the Zumafication of the party is that we must understand that this phenomenon of the Zumafication of the party, which I will just explain what I understand by it, had some theoretical roots within the party itself. Some comrades will remember that historically in this country, there has always been a contestation as to how socialism would be achieved. The SACP adopted what was called the two-stage theory. That first, we would fight for democracy, and then the struggle for socialism would follow. Of course, leading theoreticians like Joe Slovo would argue that there was no Chinese wall between the first stage and the second stage. But the question of which class would seize power or would wield state power on the morrow of the victory of the first stage was left unexplained. The other contending view, which was that of the permanent revolution or uninterrupted or continuous revolution, argued that the first stage, being led by the working class itself, should result in the conquest of political power by the working class, supported by its allies. So, in the old terminology, a dictatorship of the proletariat would have to be ushered in, or a worker state, whatever we would like to call it. So there has always been a debate between the two positions. And it used to be argued by those who maintained that the working class should capture state power even in the first stage and then open the road to socialism. That the two-stage theory subordinates the working class to the petty bourgeoisie and ultimately the bourgeoisie, and that the victory of democracy as a first stage would, instead of opening the road to socialism, consolidate capitalism. And in our context, not just capitalism, but neoliberalism in the era we are in. As I explain the Zumafication, I would always come back to this question. So the party in the 90s indeed grew. Comrades would remember some of the debates that occurred within the party particularly proponents being the likes of Comrade Harry Gwala, Jeremy Cronin, and even Dale McKinley on the nature of the party we should be building, vanguard party or mass party, and the role of theory in training communist cadres to lead the working class to socialism. So there were very important debates, comrades, that were assisting comrades to grapple with the period we were in. I think Comrade Jeremy Cronin sums up the tasks that were facing communists in the early 90s or during the unbanning of the party very well, in that we were building a party that would be rooted amongst militant workers. Remember, we had a budding trade union movement in this country, militant youths, militant workers inclined to socialist ideas, and that the party should open its ranks to such militant workers and youths, as opposed to the party being the party of a few, as Comrade Harry Gwala was arguing. So there have always been these interesting theoretical questions, even on the nature of the party itself, that we should be building. Three moments I think should be kept in mind. Firstly, comrades, that Comrade Slovo and Chris Hani rescued the party from almost liquidation of the Moses Kotane years, where the party was basically subordinated to the African National Congress. And we would remember that the early 90s is then the era whereby a mass party, or rather a mass-based vanguard party, as the term was used by then, was being built. With Chris around, and also when he was no longer around, that was still the legacy of that battle of rescuing the party from almost extinction of the Kotane years. Then we had what I would call it the second period, because after the death of Chris, there were also challenges within the party. Certainly, it didn't grow as much as was expected. And I think the Shaft 17 Congress of the party, 98, was a turning point when programs like GIA had already been adopted, or economic policies like GIA had already been adopted in 96. So the party had to grapple with that, and also grapple with the militancy of the working class in defense of jobs at that time, and also for service delivery. And would remember that that was the period of privatization. A lot of debates took place within the party. Some of these debates took place even in the Joburg Central branch of the party and other branches. Basically, this new era of growing the party, both in numbers and also qualitatively, embarking on mass political education, both within party structures and the trade union movement, is the era of Comrade Blade as the General Secretary. Lots of militant trade unionists were in the leading bodies of the party, including the Central Committee and Politburo. Party structures were being strengthened, solidified, and the party had strong influence, particularly in the trade union movement. And it was no accident that then there was also the push for the relaunching of the Young Communist League, especially from the young cadres of the SACP. Now, on the Zumafication, before I come to the third rescue period, I'm concluding, Comrade Michel. I'm about to conclude, yes. The challenge of strategy and tactics within the facing the SACP in the struggle for socialism became very much exposed in that period. With workers challenging gear and with neoliberalism biting and communities facing challenges of poor service delivery, a debate within the party occurred as to how, or rather, what route we should take. Do we continue being part of the alliance, or we stand, we sort of contest elections as the SACP on our own? That was the discussion called state power, although in my opinion, it was much more a discussion on electoral tactics than state power, because the debate on state power would be much broader than that. But what we were being faced with, Comrade, was that as both the party and COSATU used to argue that, look, the first decade of democracy had benefited by and large the bourgeoisie, as opposed to the workers and the poor. Declarations were made that the second decade should be that of the workers and the poor. Later on, even the party came up with a slogan of with and for the workers and the poor. The issue then that was facing us, comrades, was certainly that of strategy and tactics. And at that point, we revisited the question of two stages, because now we were under democracy. We could no longer talk of the first stage being something we were still fighting for. We were under democracy, but clearly democracy was not in the interest of the workers and the poor from a class standpoint. And the workers were at the receiving end and the downtrodden at large. That's why the debate then occurred. Then the issue of Zumafication comes up in the context of what we know very well, the trial of Comrade Jacob Zuma and all that. How then the party positioned itself in relation to that moment. While the party was strong at that time, and as I've said, it was quite influential in the trade union movement, instead of pursuing the debate to its logical conclusion, the question of the independent contestation of elections by the party, and the question of the party leading the alliance itself, we threw all our eggs in the Zuma basket. Basically, we subordinated the interests of the working class to those of the emergent black capital and the petty bourgeoisie. Basically, Zumafication is nothing else but the continuation of the subordination of the working class to other classes. That's one point. Secondly,
Okay.
it led to.
You have to wrap up, Zico.
Okay.
Can
yes,
you wrap
I'm
up?
wrapping up.
Okay.
I'm wrapping up, Comrade Michel. Secondly, it led to a decimation of comrades, or a decimation of political of organizations of the working class, and also the ousting of militants from the labor movement as well as the party who were arguing for the continuation of the independence of the party as well as the independence of the working class from other classes in order to pursue the struggle for socialism. So basically, Zumafication was nothing else than the subordination of the party to the ANC under the leadership of Jacob Zuma. In fact, while earlier on we had talked of the ANC route to socialism, now it became basically a Zuma route to socialism. And Comrade Jacob Zuma was brushed up as this working class militant loved by the people who would assist take the struggle for socialism forward. Basically, we threw away all political and organizational capital on the altar of Zuma. And I think the debate between comrades Jeremy Cronin and Ronnie Gazrils on what should have been the stance of the party is very instructive, and comrades should look at that, should examine that debate. And I think Comrade Gazrils stand together with those of us who argued for the party to remain independent and even contest elections and not subordinate itself to the ANC, let alone a Zuma-led ANC. I will raise other issues, as I've said, during the course of the debate. I'm sorry for taking more time, Comrade Michel. Thank you.
Thanks, Zico. Yeah, you're an unwieldy one. I never have been able to keep you on track. I want you just to turn on your camera for 1 second, even so people can see you, even if it's just upside down. And just so you all know, when I first met Zico in 2001, the first thing he told me was, he is not named after the Brazilian football player. The Brazilian football player is named after him. Right, Comrade Zico? Do you still hold that?
Certainly.
All right, wonderful. You raised lots of great points that I'm sure people will take up. The mass versus cadre. You know, I mean, the SACP, I think, has always come up with the best slogans. The mass-based vanguard party. You know, socialism is the future. Build it now, with and for the working class and for. So I'm sure all of these will kind of be issues that people raise in the discussion. All right, now one of my other favorite people, Mazibuko. And Mazibuko's not going to turn his camera on because he's having some technology issues, and it'll connect better without it. Maz, can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes, great, perfect. Thanks, Maz.
Good afternoon, Michelle. Good afternoon to all comrades who are part of the webinar. Thanks to the Democratic Marxism series for hosting this important discussion. Before I go to talk about my own issues, I just want to start elsewhere. In the lead up to today's webinar, there was a mini debate on Facebook amongst some comrades who basically, younger comrades, who one of them is an outcome of a product of the Fordist struggle from 2015, and the other is still young, but was already politically active before the rise of Fordism. So they were reviewing this webinar and basically saying, there the old people go again about their old issues. That made me think and realize that actually the history, the political debates and the struggles that have taken place in the Communist Party perhaps today are lesser known and somehow felt to be of lesser relevance by younger militants. And I think this is an important point because actually that history, those debates, those political struggles, as Zico has already pointed out, are so much relevant. And as the framing of the webinar says, explain a lot about where South Africa is today. So I'm making that point partly because the last 5-6 years have also seen the somewhat sectarian dismissal of the Communist Party, perhaps from those forces of the left who were outside the Communist Party, whether from a Pan-Africanist or Black consciousness or even Trotsky's perspective, in a way that says, we told you so, in a way that says it was always given that this would be the trajectory of the Communist Party. And in my view, that would not be a scientific reading of the actual dynamics that took place as things unfolded over a period of time in the Communist Party. That note, by the way, would apply to the key panelists for today, for us too. It cannot be an I told you so moment because it was not given that the Communist Party would be in this sorry state as it is today. Moving on then from that, I think I want to add to this phrasing about the struggle for renewal within the Communist Party. I want to add a number of points in that regard. The most seminal document that people have referred to in this regard would be Joe Slovo's Has Socialism Failed from 1989 or 19, I can't remember the exact year now. Of course, it was quite a major moment within the party where the general secretary at the time would actually open the door to a self-critique, no matter how limited, of what happened in the Soviet Union, but also how the SACP had related to all those disasters that had happened in the Soviet Union. That was quite important because it opened the door to people from other currents to begin to look at the SACP differently. And of course, for us as young people in the country, that document also came at a time when the ideological onslaught against socialism had been quite significant. Therefore, then, that document gave some kind of reassurances about the validity of the Marxist method of the socialist vision itself, which opened the door then to the massification of the party that we saw in the early 1990s. There's a little known document that was the outcome of the 1991 Congress of the Communist Party. It was called the Workers' Manifesto for a New for a Democratic South Africa, which actually put forward the beginnings of what would have been an independent program of the Communist Party post-democracy, where the Communist Party then would have a set of policy frameworks around which it would stand, but over and above that, it would campaign, which was, I think was the thrust that Chris Hani was mobilizing and building the party for. But his death put that kind of thrust to a temporary stop. A further moment in this renewal process that the Communist Party had sort of opened up for me was the 1995 strategic perspectives from the 1995 Congress, but also the 1998 political program from the 1998 Congress of the party. Both those documents I just want to cite two things from both of them. The notion of building socialism, elements of momentum for and capacity for socialism in the here and now, I think was very important because it made socialism real, concrete, practical, and immediate, and not something that has to wait for a moment of rapture or some undefined future, but there's something that we could fight for, and something that we could build a party for, something that we could build a trade union movement around, as well as broader mass movements. So I think that's quite important. And then also both the 95 and 98 documents have something very important, which I think is little understood beyond the party itself or even within the party. The phrasing that was used was our Marxism, whereby we actually do not take Marxism as a Bible, as a doctrine, which was defined at a particular period in history and now only to be applied without its development, without its expansion, without its enrichment. One of the elements of a formulation in our Marxism was a line that said the Communist Party must even do the unthinkable and rehabilitate Trotsky, which was quite something important for the Communist Party, given its Stalinist history. So I'm mentioning this because they were beginning to point to a very different direction that I think would have opened the door to a much more creative process of left renewal beyond the SACP itself. Alongside these political formulations were also independent campaigns that the Communist Party had begun to undertake. This notion of independent campaigns goes back to Chris Hane's idea of a Triple H campaign, housing, health, and hunger, which was already something he was putting forward even before 1994. And that's very interesting because the focus at the time was the transition, the negotiations, as well as then the elections of 1994 and what it would mean to form a new government. But beyond 94, then what were other independent campaigns? Were those focusing on land reform, make banks serve the people, on cooperatives? But even though there were these independent campaigns, what is striking is that the Communist Party had a very limited involvement in independent mass struggles of the working class, either at the workplace or in communities. It would only join up with those of COSATU, which were against privatization and job losses. But even those that were led by COSATU, the Communist Party was not found present in the manner that it should have. Even when it comes to anti-privatization, actually the Communist Party had sort of initially accepted the gear policy until militants in the Communist Party, as well as the sheer weight of COSATU and its position, forced basically the Communist Party to rethink its position. All of these debates, all of these independent campaigns and political formulations, ultimately though, were limited because this independent thrust of the Communist Party was ultimately harnessed by the leadership of Zimande and Cronin to away from SACP autonomy, away from SACP independence, to basically use the SACP as a ram, as a battering ram, as a factor in ANC dynamics, as Zico was explaining with reference to the Zuma movement. So basically, this point I've been making since I started by referring to Joe Slovo's 1989 paper has been that indeed there was a moment of renewal which had started in 1989, but by 2005, 2007, that moment of renewal, no matter what its ebbs and flows were over the policy formulations, the political programs, the independent campaigns, and the various debates, ultimately it was harnessed by 2005, 2007 to basically the factional battle that was taking place in the ANC. And the Communist Party from that moment on could no longer claim in any way to have an independent socialist program for which it took responsibility, which it took to society, and which it would defend irrespective of what happens in the ANC. Now, I want to put forward a fairly controversial formulation, which I think sums up the shifting positions of the Communist Party since it became a key proponent for Zuma. From that moment, it was a proponent for Zuma. I think it took a counter-revolutionary position. The Communist Party essentially became counter-revolutionary. Today, as Zuma's arrest and the consequence and what followed after have confirmed, Zuma is indeed a political criminal, and the Communist Party has stood behind a political criminal it was aware of from the word go. And many of us had voiced concerns, critiques, and so on about how this strategy of supporting Jacob Zuma was actually irresponsible and selling out the revolution. So the Communist Party took a counter-revolutionary position. And today, from having been occupied a counter-revolutionary position, the Communist Party has shifted firmly to stand behind neoliberalism. So I think the last 12 to 15 years of the Communist Party can indeed be summed up in that phrase, from counter-revolution to neoliberalism. I think I'm not just being controversial in that regard, but actually trying to understand what has happened to the Communist Party in a very rigorous way, which then puts the challenge to those militants who are in the Communist Party. Because indeed, whilst the Communist Party officially has shifted from counter-revolution to neoliberalism, but indeed there are militants in the Communist Party who are committed to the vision of socialism, who actually are real class fighters. The challenge I want to put to them is, what are they doing in the Communist Party that can change what happens to that party, and in a way that can go beyond the prism of the SACP? Because ultimately the struggles of poor and working people have to go beyond those limits of the SACP. Is it enough that they keep arguing that it's about removing Blade Nzimande from power, or are there more political, programmatic, and theoretical questions that they need to face up to, even the very formulation of the notion of a national democratic revolution, or even the very idea of hanging on onto an alliance with the ANC, or even other elements of theory that require attention of Marxists in a rigorous way? I just want to pose three of those questions, three of those theoretical challenges today. For example, what is the nature of the post-apartheid accumulation regime? We really need some serious analysis in that regard. What is the nature of the post-apartheid social formation? Particularly now, even more so after the COVID retrenchments, and even more so now in this deepening unemployment crisis, in this deepening ecological crisis. What implications arise there for the post-apartheid social formation? The last theoretical question I want to pose as something that requires Marxist analysis and Marxist strategy is the question of the balance of forces, the balance of power between the popular classes and the ruling classes. Those questions I don't think are formulaic, methodical questions that just are being thrown to demonstrate the need for the theoretical things, but actually those questions will define what happens to the left going forward. To conclude, given that the SACP's failures and the SACP's holding back of the renewal that we had seen in an earlier period, what do we do today as socialists to renew a left project? Given that many communist militants are actually in the SACP. But of course, we realize that there are other socialist militants outside the SACP. So for me, the whole question is not so much historical, but about looking forward into a process of left renewal in a new way, without dismissing those positive attributes of the Communist Party. Thanks, I hope it was coherent.
Excellent, Mazibuko. Yes, it was very coherent. And again, you raised fantastic, different points in Zico, but wonderful points, and also threw back some great challenges to both members of the SACP and I think the broader left in general. So hopefully that will be kind of brought up more and you can elaborate a bit more during this. Now let me turn to our third and final speaker, also very dear to me. Vish, can you, and I think Vish is going to have his camera on. He's not upside down and not having technological. Oh, okay. So yep, Vish, I can see your slide, so should be good. Okay.
Thanks
Vish.
and good afternoon. Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for being in attendance. South Africa is at a very dangerous place, and it's very important we use this moment to reflect deeply on that. The South African Communist Party, for me, well, it's been a long association, and I'd like to start with that. In the 1980s, one of my political homes was the Indian Congress. It was Bolshevized, so there was a crude Marxism, Leninism in it, coming from some associated with the SACP underground. And that was a very important influence. But there was also a very, very dear uncle who was trained in the Soviet Union as an intelligence operative. He was in Operation Vula. And he also was associated with an underground press of the SACP, and that brought a very strong influence into my own life, making me a Marxist at age 15. So the party had a very important appeal in the early 90s, particularly in terms of trying to rethink socialism and its fundamental sort of concepts and perspectives. It was also a party of non-racialism, and I'm going to say a lot about that today. It had an important sort of theoretical analysis of colonialism of the special type, and contributed in pioneering ways to the non-racial tradition in practice. I mean, the leadership composition of the party before 1994 was very, very inspiring. I mean, whether it was Bram Fischer, whether it was Moses Kotane, whether it was Yusuf Dadu, etc., they embodied this non-racial tradition. Now, I want to agree with other panelists, the mass party formulation, no matter how you construct this formula, vanguard mass party, well, it never really take off. In practice, the party remained, if you like, a sort of faction or a desk inside the ANC-led alliance. It considered itself the intellectual of the alliance, but in many, many ways, of course, the ANC had so many other sources of intellectual influence, including the World Bank and the IMF and the World Economic Forum. So the party really was uninfluential. The strategic breakthrough, socialism is the future, build it now, in 1995 was very, very important. And here I want to agree with Mazibuko as well. This wasn't translated into an effective political program that could be taken forward to and actually galvanize a whole set of social forces. In the context of Gauteng, we attempted to experiment with sort of programmatic elements, but the party leadership was always reining those kinds of things in. The party failed to confront neoliberalization. The first critique of GEAR was made collectively in the National Education Secretariat of the party. I was part of that, Dale McKinley and Langa Zita. Of course, it wasn't published in the leadership, in the journal as well, but it was published in debate. But the critique of GEAR was very, very important because that was a shift away from even a kind of neo-Keynesian approach to macroeconomic management. But the party leadership was slow off the blocks to kind of really grapple with this shift. And of course, Zumafication kicks in, and it was the shortcut to power, as others have been saying. And it ethnicized politics, it brought a racism to the fore, it brought a patriarchy to the fore, particularly during Zuma's rape trial. And all of these dynamics and tendencies have fed into the kind of authoritarian populism, I would even say a neo-fascism that's coursing its way through our society today. So the cult of the big man was actually constructed inside the Communist Party. And of course, the current leader thinks he is the big man, indispensable to the left and so on, the general secretary for life. But essentially the party was reduced to a faction. So it took an opportunistic path to power. And in the end, it did not displace the trajectory of crisis that South Africa has been on. Actually, it has fed into that trajectory of crisis. An alternative working class project has not been articulated. And I don't think it's going to be coming from the South African Communist Party. And I was expelled for my reflections on these questions in this volume, New Frontiers for Socialism in the 21st Century, where I deal more critically with these issues. So we are living through a total crisis of South African capitalism. It's a criminalized market democracy, and I don't have time to go into the different conjunctures and the shifts that have been there, sort of pushing us and propelling us in this direction. But we observed it in different ways, sort of kleptocratic, transactional class formation practices, the thinning out of our democracy, coordinated more and more to credit rating agencies, etc., etc. And there have been various flashpoints and points of contention and crisis in our society. Marikana being one of them, the rebellion of poor and rural workers in immediate wake of Marikana, a whole host of civic protest actions, to the point where we have a situation on the ground where there is a deep crisis of legitimacy of the state and so on. But essentially what we've seen over the past few weeks, in my view, 2 weeks, has been the explosion of the Afro-neoliberal class project. It completely like disintegrated at a societal level. It basically faced its own construction. And I'll say more about that. But what we are living through is a convergence of the failures of the ANC-led alliance, its politics, its expedient politics, its politics of band-aids, stuff, and so on. And permanent crisis management. We're moving from one crisis to another crisis to another crisis, and essentially converging with systemic crisis tendencies. We've had the worst drought in our history, and there's been no lessons learned. And climate change is going to be a major challenge to us. We have one of the most unequal societies in the world. 10% of our income earners take home 65% of income. 10% of our population own 80% of our wealth. Resource peak, we have a weak market democracy. All of these things have come together. And there's been an attempt intellectually actually to grapple with these issues and to actually put up the mirror to society. It cannot be suggested that the left in South Africa has been unthinking, that this moment that we're living through is a sudden surprise. It's actually not a surprise. And I want to say something about radical non-racialism and connect it back to the SACP. So the SACP contributed in a very, very important way to one strand of non-racialism, which becomes official ANC-led alliance non-racialism. There's also formal non-racialism in our constitution, and we have a people's non-racialism in South Africa. And people's non-racialism is about confronting all the divisions of apartheid in our communities and in our society on the different fronts in which we fought against apartheid. It also embodies a critique of capitalism, which is very, very important, which gets lost in liberal articulations of non-racialism and so on. The Freedom Charter, in my view, is a good example of people's non-racialism. I don't surrender the Freedom Charter to any political organization. It was a people's document. So the non-racial tradition has deep roots. We saw it during lockdown level 5. And it's amazing the kind of solidarities, the positive solidarities, the connections that were being made between peoples during lockdown 5. We were in a deep crisis. The crisis of socio-ecological reproduction caught up with us. We didn't have a caring government. Hunger was widespread and still is. But people through soup kitchens, gardens, informal traders, subsistence fishers, etc., were holding things together. People were giving donations and money, etc. And that was a very, very powerful indicator of grassroots non-racialism. During the recent breakdown, and I'll say something about that, you saw non-racialism at the front lines of communities, trying to hold it together, trying to protect themselves, etc. And I think what's very, very crucial is that we start to try to explain the racism in our society and its persistence. And I'm not going to answer, but I'm just going to say that the crisis of the ANC nation building project, its failure, is at the heart of the persistence of racism in South Africa. It's failed to grapple with the structural, the spatial, the institutional conditions that continue to engender racism, even at an individual level in our society. But I want to say that the humanism of the non-racial tradition is very, very important for where we are as a country. It's a resource. I was having a conversation to Jay Naidu yesterday. He said it's the best gift that the movement gave the world, actually. And so I want to reaffirm that. And it's something that we must hold on to. We must deepen, we must theorize, and we must make sure it lives in the everyday fabric of our lives, particularly now and coming out of this moment. The societal breakdown we've lived through, and that's what it's been, by the way, reflects a failed response of the state in terms of public violence, in terms of preemption. I mean, a lot could have done at the N3 moment with the trucks burning to really prevent escalation. And it's clear in today's times that state intelligence failed completely. There definitely was instigation of societal chaos. And you've seen attempts to bargain Zuma's release in the midst of all of this within social media, etc. But I'm not a convert to the insurrectionary narrative. There was hunger, there was opportunism, and of course, a lot of racism and ethnicity, etc., came to the fore. The notion of black on black violence is a very contested idea, and it's a reactionary idea, which most of us rejected to characterize whether what was happening in KZN in the early 90s and so on, or in the hostels and so on in Gauteng. But actually, we had black on black violence. And that for me is an index of how reactionary our society became over a few days. The state was completely absent and communities were left to themselves. And there's some very heart-rending stories that come through from this moment. And if we really don't do our research and understand what was happening in communities, we're really going to get it wrong as the left. I mean, I have anecdotes to share, and we can say more about this. But in Morningside, for example, you had middle classes, Africans, Indians, coloreds, etc., all standing together and forming a defense committee because they were completely afraid. You look at Pietermaritzburg in Northdale, historically an Indian community, but very mixed now. There you also had African informal settlements together with Indian people, all standing together to try and protect themselves from any kind of violence and so on. Very complicated. In Katlehong, the first victim of the violence in Katlehong was an African woman informal trader. Her shop was completely destroyed. Okay, so it was a very complex moment of societal breakdown, and all the kind of sociological categories we use, the negative, etc., have a place here, but we need to have a deeper understanding of what happened here. Phoenix, for me, is indicative of the worst of what's happened. And the killing there, particularly by vigilantes, Indian vigilantes, particularly by security forces. Here I'm talking about private security and so on, is but again, it's something that has to be investigated. There's a lot of noise and social media noise around this, and there has to be proper perspective. Both African and Indian people were killed in that moment. And we really need to study it, and we need to make sure the investigations are done judiciously and effectively to bring resolution to this matter. But there are community-led just peace-building processes, and we saw this. In my hometown, Pietermaritzburg, that's what's happening right now. African and Indian communities, at least where I come from, are working together to address some of these issues, and they're having hard, honest conversations. They are truth platforms. They are grappling with who they are as a peoples. Abashlali is intervening and making some very, very thoughtful interventions against the re-racializing of our society. So how do we prevent our society from descending into racial hatred and chaos? I think this is a very, very fundamental question that we've got to grapple with. And so, is there a need for the left to step up? Given how bad this crisis is, given how much of ground that has been lost on the left and so on. Is it time for the left to consider a party? Is it time for the left to build movements, etc.? I think these are the things we got to grapple with. And I want to argue that actually we cannot be mechanical about this question. There is a history of post-apartheid struggle, and there have been cycles of struggle. And of course, there have been weaknesses and limits, etc. But the crisis in South Africa is necessitating us to collectively grapple with this question. Partyism in itself, just forming a left party, is not necessarily, I would say, an adequate response. It's not enough. And partyism also is a shortcut how we grapple with the power question. At the same time, we cannot also keep on beating ourselves over the head and constantly be arguing we got to build movements, and movements are then the stepping stone to build a party. We are in a very, very complex moment. The historical block that's led this country is unraveling. There are major social realignments going on in society. There are detachments from ANC-led alliance politics. And so there's an immense fluidity, and a lot of things can crystallize at this moment, particularly if the left is able to play a constructive role and step up and provide leadership. And so this moment is a very, very critical moment to entertain this discussion and which should lead to some kind of collective resolution. One group, etc., cannot solve this question. We've been having a left dialogue for the past four years of introspection, of clarification, etc. And we will be surfacing a set of documents around the crisis, around democratizing a criminalized market democracy, and around what form and what strategy for a left party, and hopefully convening a conference next year to grapple with this question. Again, this is not saying there's going to be a party, but we do need to grapple with this question given where our society is. And finally, I would say there's been a lot of intellectual ferment on the left, even outside the Communist Party over the past few decades. And a crucial idea that's coming to the fore as part of renewing our left imagination is the idea of democratic eco-socialism that is also feminist, that is also deeply about radical non-racialism, and that is about building an agency from below, a subject in history that can lead transformation. And I really think that there are important sort of developments that can take us in this direction. One being the climate justice charter process. The other is rural land struggles, and so on and so on. We need to bring that into the conversation. Thank you for your time.
Hi, sorry, there, great. Okay, sorry. Thanks, Vish, that was great. That was wonderful. I think all three of our panelists have actually given us really wonderful kind of reflections on, especially the more theoretical, ideological, but also the kind of context-specific practical stuff. So there's been quite a few questions and comments in the chat box. I'm going to give the speakers a chance to just read through them quickly, and I'm going to summarize. I've been writing them down, so I'm just going to do a quick summary of the questions. I've tried to pull them together, and then I'd like Vish, Mazibuko, and Zico, I'll give them all a chance to respond to this first set that I've been writing down. Okay, so first there was a question about whether the SACP is really speaking, the current SACP is really speaking to the current context. And do they actually, I think, speak to our realities of our current moment? And this then related to a question about the relationship between theory and practice, that the SACP like it's stronger on theory, but it doesn't actually kind of have a deep sense of practice. And the speakers also spoke to this a bit. I think that also links to a couple other points that were raised about the ideological orientation, or what is the role of ideology. One question was about whether there's flexibility built into the SACP's ideological orientation. Then there was another question about, is this deep kind of ideological crisis that we're in, that should we look to alternative ideologies to resolve the current context? And I think the question was really asking us, does ideology really help us anymore today? There was a response that was saying that Marx and Engels' kind of vision of a democratic internationalism is enough. But I think that there is a very profound and important question in this. And it's related to, I think, the relationship between theory and practice, but also what is the role of ideology and how do we prevent it from becoming dogmatic ideology, and basically, it becomes a new form of a Bible or a Quran, or, a text that we read in a unchanging way. So I think I'd like to hear all of you guys reflect on that. Then there was a question about and this I think relates to, partly in a different way, the context question, that the SACP is not really capturing a lot of the youth, and then there was a question about the demographics of youth and women in the party, but how is it that the party is not speaking to the youth when I think there is this crisis? So reflecting on that. And then there was a question, a few points about the alliance. One just I think about the alliance. Will the party leave is it thinking about leaving the alliance? Will it leave the alliance? There was a question that said, or a comment about the alliance, that part of the problem, I mean, we know part of the problem is the alliance with the state, that it has become more interested in its relationship to the state. But there's also a question about it being an alliance with a trade union movement that no longer is acting as an organ that speaks to the aspirations of the working class. And then now it's really much more just an arm of the state. And then, I think there's some questions about what is the probability of various Marxist tendencies coalescing? Like, how do we overcome these sectarianisms that we have today? And yeah, so I think that if you guys can all speak a bit to these. I mean, it's interesting because, these were also some of the questions when I was studying the party that came up throughout as well, just about how the party actually, and at that time, I think I studied it still when it was one of the more interesting kind of voices on the left. But I would like you guys to talk about, is there a way to find relevance in parties today? And is the SACP one of those? Okay, Zico, you've had the most time to think about some of this. Yeah, can you start? Okay,
yeah.
And Zico, I'm going to be more disciplined with you. I'm going to make sure, I'm going to give you 3 to 5 minutes, and then I'm going to be disciplined.
Yeah, Comrade Michelle, I'm a Marxist from the countryside. Anyway, let me combine three questions into one. SACP and reality, theory and practice, ideology. Look, in some cases, if we take Marigana, for example, SACP basically betrayed Marxism there. Its characterization of that moment, what was happening there, and even AMCU as warlord unionism or union warlordism, and also justifying the killing of those workers in Marikana, basically equating workers who were armed with the police and saying the police are also workers in uniform. For me, that was clearly a betrayal of the Marxist understanding of the state as an organ of class rule, to equate armed workers with police and just say police are workers in uniform. That was a betrayal. In Marigana, the SACP basically buried Marxism. Secondly, in relation to fees must fall, the SACP again took a very, very opportunistic position. It subordinated the interests of the students, working class students or middle class students, to those of the bourgeoisie. You would remember that government in the first wave said 6% when students were saying 0% increase. The government said 6.5. And then what? And the SACP supported the government instead of supporting the fighting students. It's history that in the second wave of fees must fall, it's JZ who implemented free education as we know of it today, when the party was defending bourgeois neoliberal budget, saying there is no money for this, no money for that. The party, in relation to fees must fall, didn't stand with the students. It stood with a neoliberal government. Thirdly, in Khutsong, Mirafong, the party never drew lessons from that, because there was a mass struggle not started by the party, but by people who simply wanted to be consulted in terms of their own future. The party was able to lead a broad range of forces there. However, it never drew the important theoretical and political lessons that it has to basically it didn't generalize that struggle. Instead, that it relegated that struggle to something of a ghetto, because it continued to be within the alliance and accepting ANC leadership of the alliance. And one point that was raised was that was the failures of ANC-led alliance. As far as I'm concerned, the ANC, comrades, as the party of national liberation, basically the party of progressive Black nationalism, was always going to fail to complete the democratic revolution. This is an old theoretical question as to which class under which party political mechanism can complete the democratic revolution. The SACP said the ANC, whereas the SACP should have taken responsibility for the democratic revolution and lead it instead of accepting ANC leadership. So in terms of theory and practice, in some cases, the SACP has been consistent in selling out. In other cases, it has been contradicting it, preaching socialism, but defending capitalism and neoliberal capitalism. So for me, those three moments capture the ideological crisis of the SACP. But in terms of the future, I would agree with Comrade Vish that it's broader than social movements, unions, party. In fact, I think when NUMSA came up with the formula of, in their resolution, Movement for Socialism, a vanguard party, or a mass workers party, flagging all those three options for the left to debate, left in the SACP, left outside the SACP, that was the debate we should have had. And for me, I think we still have to, the militants still have to ensure that the SACP becomes what Chris and Slovo wanted it to be. That's the third rescue now that must happen. And one of the things is that the SACP must get out of the bourgeois government. That's another sellout, that's a betrayal of Marxism, that communists can be in the executive committee to manage the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, because that's what the state is. How can communists be part of a bourgeois government? That militants in renewing the SACP should be saying their leaders or our leaders should be out of the bourgeois government. Yes, we can remain in the legislatures as tribunes of the people, but in the bourgeois state, that's a clear betrayal. Let me end there for now, Comrade Mish.
Thanks, Zico. Mazibuko?
Zico has said a lot, which I agree with, so I will not be long as a result. Hold on, let me just close the door to the noise. Sorry about that, I'm back. There was this question about the role of ideology, whether ideology helps us today and how we prevent ideology from being dogmatic. Without a doubt, it's not possible to understand the world, capitalism, without a particular world outlook. So ideology serves an important role in that regard, particularly then Marxist ideology and broadly other anti-capitalist ideologies that help us to understand the problems of a capitalist society. However, what is going to be important with ideology is that it must be open-ended. It cannot be doctrinaire. It cannot divorce itself from unfolding reality, from struggles, from dynamics of movements, and so on. Therefore, ideology itself has to be built and continuously reinforced from below, from struggles, from dynamics, from movements. I think that's absolutely crucial. That question of ideology is going to be, of an open-ended approach to ideology is going to be crucial also when we seek to overcome sectarianism, as was asked by another question. in that regard, there's a huge need for the left to unlearn a lot of the determinist approaches that we've had from the past, but at the same time, to be willing to learn new lessons from what is emerging, from struggles from below. For example, there are new forms of worker organizing that have emerged that go beyond the traditional trade union movement. What does that mean for how socialists of different hues engage with those new forms of worker organizing and support those new forms of worker organizing, while at the same time paying attention to the rather weak trade union movement, which still has an important role to play. So for me, all those questions about ideology, about the trade union movement and overcoming sectarianism are best addressed by a left that constantly renews itself through its practice.
Thanks,
Hi.
Maz. That was great. Vish?
Yeah, I'll just add 1 or 2 points. I mean, particularly adding to what Mazibuko said about ideology, just to highlight 2 things related to that. I think what's important is the idea of collective intellectual practice. And collective intellectual practice doesn't have to happen just through a party. Collective intellectual practice can happen through the intersections of various social and political forces. And that can generate knowledge, and that can generate strategic perspectives and so on. And that's very, very important. I mean, just to further add to what Mazibuko was saying, you know, the old style vanguardist tradition assumes the party has the monopoly of knowledge, it has the scientific truth, and so on. But what we know is that in the lived experience of people, and as they try to figure out the contradictions that they're living with and struggling against, there is tacit knowledge, there's organic knowledge. And that's also very, very important for the ideological project. I mean, if you look at the Climate Justice Charter, it has 14 systemic alternatives, from zero waste, which is championed by waste pickers, food sovereignty, which is championed by small-scale farmers, etc., and so on and so on. Climate jobs by trade unions. The just transition idea comes from trade unions. This is all organic knowledge, and this is part of the ideological project that we must be open-minded about. My final point is just about left in South Africa. Now, we've had a variegated left. We've had an academic left, we've had an institutional political left, we've had a social movement left, trade union left, and so on. And all of those left components have run into crisis in different ways. I mean, if you look at the academic left, I mean, most of them don't even discourse even through a critical thinking Marxism. Okay, they're few and far between. They've abandoned that kind of framework of thinking. But if you look at you know, other forms of left, the labor left, I mean, the labor left has really stopped grappling in a rigorous way as a collective intellectual. It's a problem. But the point I want to make here is that the vanguardist left is the greatest challenge we have to unity. Because the vanguardist politics is that you will hegemonize, you will lead, you will take over, etc., etc. And it sits there in the imaginary, in the consciousness of various sort of currents of the left. We've got to overcome that. And that is why I'm engaged with the Democratic Marxism project, to really find the pluralism of the left in a genuine way. And yes, you can bring this all together politically. You can have a political formation, whatever form that takes, that has different currents in it, that can be institutionalized. There are rules for engagement. You see, the ANC doesn't have this. That's why factionalism is tearing the ANC apart, okay? But there are other left experiences that we can learn from. Thanks.
Thanks, Vish. All right, great. You guys are disciplined. So now I'm going to go on to another set of questions. One question was about asking whether South Africa today, with, they say, with weak social democratic and strong neoliberalism, whether this kind of current context could be compared to the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1920s. And really the question's asking, you know, that gave rise to fascism. And I think it's asking, are we on the kind of similar cusp of possible fascisms? And then there was a question about what steps do we need to realize a knowledge and manufacturing based economy like South Korea. I actually have that because I think we need to be very careful when we put up South Korea, but I'll let the panelists respond. And if they haven't, I might say something. Then there was a question about that the SACP also failed in its internationalist. And there was a question that talked about, you know, kind of internationalists versus nationalists. And if you guys want to reflect on that, but this part, question relates to the xenophobic attacks. And I'm not sure because the SACP wasn't behind this. So I think it's more that it hasn't been able to prevent xenophobia rising in South Africa. And so what kind of international is it actually, how deep is this? Goes back to the question about ideology, and there's specifically a question around the roots of the two-stage theory and the ideological roots, but I think it's linking back to this point that you guys have touched on already, and that previous questions touched on, is, you know, the relationship between, well, the comment said blind theory and rather than practice. And I think a number of you, Mazibuko and Vish both, you know, the relationship between theory and practice. Theory is important, but you know, it constantly is evolving as conditions change and we kind of are rooted in practice. But if you want to maybe speak a little bit more to that, and maybe specifically to the theory. There was a question which I don't think is you guys could probably answer, but it's just there was a question about the inequality of subsidies to universities. And I think it was really about the differences of fees. That I don't know that you guys would want to speak to, but there was a question about that. And then there was a question that was, this was to Zico, just how do you lead a democratic revolution if you're, you know, if you're not willing to be in a democratic government? I think that is a really fundamental question. And then there was a question, and I'm not sure because I didn't see this exactly, but if you guys could all, if you have a view on the Diwe Sisulu's statement of 18th July, and I guess she said that the SACP needs to play its vanguard role. And if you guys have any kind of views on that. And I know while I was speaking now, a few more questions came through. So I actually have looked at those, and if they don't touch on them, I'm going to go back and read them now. So I don't know if you want to, do you guys want to go in a different order, or should we stick to this order? Do you have a view? It doesn't seem like you have a view. Okay, I'm going to stick to the order. Zico.
Let's stick to this order, Comrade Mish.
Okay, but I'm going to be strict with you, my.
Oh. The question of the democratic revolution and not being part of the bourgeois government. Let me just refer the comrades to Marx. His address to the Central Committee of the Communist League in 1850. To Engels on the eve of the Italian Revolution, his piece in 1860 or 1861. He covers that question. They cover this issue very well on what role communists should play. The question of legislatures as opposed to the bourgeois government. There is no time to elaborate, but I think those pieces would help comrades. As I've just said, the SACP should be out of the bourgeois government, but be in legislatures. And also, even in legislatures, it must not account to the SACP, to the ANC. It must have its own caucuses. In fact, Comrade Jacob Zuma was much more progressive than the SACP when he proposed a quota, that the SACP should have a quota of comrades who speak openly, independently, as communists, accounting to the SACP in parliaments and provincial legislatures and municipal councillors. So the vanguard role of the SACP, that's part of it. To answer that part, Lindy Ware and the vanguard role, that would be part of it. But more, Mazibuko and Comrade Vish earlier on raised the question of the mass struggles in which the SACP was not involved. A vanguard party would be involved in such struggles, develop cadres, learn from those struggles, reorient itself. If the SACP had enmeshed itself in fees must fall in the struggles of Marikana, it would not have taken such wrong positions. In fact, it would have corrected its mistakes. You can take wrong positions, but you would correct your mistakes because you learn from those struggles. Let me end there for now, Comrade Nish.
Thanks, Zico. Maz?
Thanks. I'll pick up on this point. So what I think Zico is saying when he says if the SACP had taken the leading role in the struggle to defeat apartheid and achieve democracy, and so the question I understand it to be saying, how can you say that, and yet you say the SACP must not be in a bourgeois government? So for me, the question is basically about how communists approach democracy and how they connect the struggle for democracy to ultimately the struggle for socialism. So that would be the first distinction, which I think would distinguish a communist party and the leadership of the struggle to end apartheid and to win a democracy. But also then many other questions will be approached very differently, whether it's about powers of the executive, whether it's about the right to recall, whether it's about community and worker control of public assets and so on. Whereas an ANC would not approach those things necessarily from a radical anti-capitalist perspective, whereas it would be expected of a communist party to approach even a whole range of questions, socio-economic, political, and other questions from a radical transformative socialist perspective. I hope that makes sense. But also, if what Zico is referring to here as a bourgeois government is the fact that it is not a government that is an outcome of your typical working class revolution against capitalism, or a government that is an outcome of that is formed by socialists winning elections. It is essentially a capitalist government under capitalism, and it's not sending any signal in any direction about even changing the accumulation logic of the capitalism we have today. So I think I don't think the two can be put together. The notion of leading the struggle for democracy and also serving in a bourgeois government. Again, there's no time to go deeper on these issues. I think Terry's points about internationalism are important because ultimately we can no longer talk about the South African working class in a closed way. The very South African working class is internationalized. The very South Africa is part of international capitalism. The question for me is the practical meaning of that internationalism today. For example, if you look at economic policy, there was long discussion about what would you do if you had a regional trade perspective, a regional integration perspective? What does it mean for domestic industrial policy? You can extend that to questions of democracy in the region, but beyond the region itself to what you do globally in terms of how you position and build an anti-imperialist bloc. So I think all of those questions come in, and I think those are necessarily part of what a renewed socialism would be about. And of course, today, the ecological question looms large in any internationalism we need to talk about. So I think that question remains open. That question about the Weimar Republic and the possibilities of fascism, I've long said this, Ashraf. I've long said that the material conditions that we have in South Africa are ripe for a black-led right-wing social upheaval. If you could have a Mashaba, now a Zuma, and other such forces who can harness the massive desperation, harness it in a more systematic way than what we've seen in the last 2 weeks. I think we could be foreseeing some danger. Up to now, the ANC has been able, not up to now, up to a few years back, the ANC has been able to hold all of these forces together, but the ANC is becoming unstuck now as the glue that would have held society together. So even the right-wing elements in the ANC are becoming bolder and bolder, and I think we're likely to see more daring experiments where the black right-wing is becoming more emboldened. What makes it more possible also is the seduction of culture, of heritage, of religion. Here in the Eastern Cape, there was something called Godly Governance Network, which holds prayers weekly at the Bisho legislature and at all buildings in Bisho. Part of its discourse is that the reason we have a crisis in this country is because there is ungodly governance. All of those speak to some kind of, it won't exactly be the same as in Germany, but some kind of reactionary organizing right wing that's beginning to enter the doors of political power in quite a significant way. And I think this actually is quite a serious danger if it's not challenged by a renewed left. Thanks.
If I can just add a few points, I've shared some resources around how we think about fascism. It was a special issue of the Canadian Review of Sociology, and I co-edited it with Christopher Chase Dunn from the World Systems Institute. And there's an introduction, and I shared a piece on the Black neo-fascism of the EFF. Now, we are faced with the second coming of fascism. The conditions are there for it, except that methodologically, we are challenged to think about and characterize this new fascism. Liberals basically work with a checklist, and it's, is it the big man? Is it the autocrat? Are they violent? Are they racializing and ethnicizing politics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And with that checklist, they classify fascism. Marxism has a much more richer approach to thinking about fascism and looking at it in situ, in context, looking at its political economy, and in the context of a globalizing monopoly capitalism today, and recognizing what is particular to it. Now, religion is definitely featuring in the second coming of fascism. Religious fundamentalism, charismatic religion of all kinds, etc. That's new, and that's also part of the kind of new fascism that's emerging. In the South African context, we are trying to grapple with this as well in the next volume of the Democratic Marxism series and internationally. That will be out soon. It's titled Destroying Democracy, Neoliberal Capitalism and the Rise of Authoritarian Politics. My own contribution is about how we think through eco-fascism today, particularly as it relates to the climate contradiction. But we must, in this conversation, ask what's next, because the upheavals we've lived through over the past 2 weeks are not over. And I agree with Mazibuko about the convergence of right-wing forces. If the right-wing, and it's categories advisedly, but let's just say the kind of RET right, in inverted commas, converges with the EFF, and there's a more organized expression of their politics, maybe enlisting an alliance with Mashaba, etc. This is a very deadly situation facing the country. And we cannot bury our heads in the sand and sit back as the left. From now till the ANC conference, more race baiting of all kinds, more destabilization of the country is going to happen. And we got to start thinking about this very, very seriously as the left. Ashraf, in terms of austerity and so on, I do have something out in the next socialist register, which deals with this issue, what I call epidemiological neoliberalism. And it looks at how the ANC state has dealt with this current conjuncture of the pandemic, the austerity and so on. But for our conversation, what is striking is, again, an SACP government, SACP segment imposing this austerity on society, failing in its food response, failing to provide adequate supports to society. A good contrast here is Kerala, India, where the Communist Party there in power ensured that the state was serving society. For the first time in their history, they were elected now for a second term, back to back. And that's because they positioned the state completely to address the needs of society. The South African Communist Party in the midst of this pandemic is as culpable as the Ramaphosa regime. I'm going to make just two final points, Michelle, so you don't have to call me back. I mean, you can work your way to, differently. I want to talk to Terry Bell's point about party and converging forces, etc. Now, Frantz Fanon has a very interesting concept, and I've spoken to this before, around a people-led party. We've also seen a post-social democratic wave of left parties in the world. We've seen them in Europe with Syriza, the party of the left, in Germany, and you've seen it with the Brazilian PT. You now have the MAS in Bolivia and so on. They are very, very interesting experiments for us to continue to learn from. They're all not perfect, but they've all tried to kind of break with some kind of technocratic politics. Some got it right, some didn't, and so on. I really do believe that we have to start rethinking the political instrument and the political form. And again, there's some very novel ways in which we can think about this. There's the idea of the connective party in Europe. There's the idea of the party movement, and what I would call the citizens movement driven party. And it's something that we need to debate, unpack, and grapple with, because the kind of forms of representation we have through typical multi-party democracy have limits, and they're not enough for accountability. At the same time, we are not enabling the strengthening of the grassroots of our democracy. There's a serious disconnect. So I think there's room for us to innovate around new forms of political agency, representation, and even political structures, if we want to go there as the left. My final point is around democracy. Comrades, we must not make the mistake of conflating democracy with capitalism. Capitalism and democracy grew up alongside each other, and they were always in tension. They were always in contradiction. All the gains we've had, whether it's rights, whether it's freedoms, whether it's procedural basis for democracy, the institutional basis for democracy, all that comes from class and popular struggles against oppression, at least in the modern sense of history. And whether it's anti-slavery, against colonialism, whether it's the feudal order, etc., etc. We must never surrender democracy to liberalism. Liberalism is always about taming democracy, eviscerating democracy, and limiting democracy. And we've seen its current form, what I would call market democracy. Okay, so we must never surrender democracy to capitalism and to liberalism. We must defend it, we must deepen it, we must strengthen it. In South Africa, it's a product of our common struggle.
Thanks, Vish. Just a note on the democracy. I mean, obviously you care a lot about this issue of democracy. But to say that this book on the rising kind of authoritarianism and reclaiming democracy, it'll be out next week. And like all the other democratic Marxism volumes, we've managed to get it freely downloadable anywhere in the world. So in about 2 weeks' time, you will be able to, or you can buy it if you want the book itself. I'm still old school. I like to have kind of books that I turn pages on. But if you want it, it will be freely downloadable, and Jane can pass the link on when it's out. Okay, there's a few more really interesting questions, and we have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to go through them quickly. None of you guys touched on the South Korean question, and I want to say, because I really think this is hugely important, we need to be very careful about South Korea. A lot of their manufacturing and knowledge creation that has happened, and how they basically have jumped into being considered a core economy, is at the expense of labor. You know, it has been enormously weakened and eroded in the South Korean context. They virtually have lost the right to strike. They now are labor's doing very exceptional types of protests where they basically do high altitude stakeouts, where they go up on a huge crane or on a huge thing outside their workplace and spend a year, like one person up there. It's really quite tragic. And so we need to be careful when we just see kind of the outcome and not the very real horrors that come with it. Okay, so let me just quickly, so Vish already talked to the one question about austerity and the analysis. Then there was a question, okay, so I think Vish's, the issue of kind of citizens organizations, around the Bill of Rights, but also around kind of the role of democracy. I think those are similar types of questions. And I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that a bit more, but it's basically that I think that the comment there around citizens organizing and uniting and their organizations is really about various ways to deepen democracy. So Parliament, the problem is we've reduced democracy to just Parliament. It's one component, and it is a necessary component. I would really argue with anybody who would not think that. We can have another debate another time, but these, I think, are comments that about the much broader understanding of democracy. And I think then this relates to the question of, can you achieve socialism through a parliamentary route? And I don't know if you guys want to say anything about that. There's a question about if any of you want to say something about Chinese socialism, your thoughts on Chinese socialism and its progress. I mean, I think that's actually, you know, the idea that it's socialist is an interesting one. So then there's a question or a comment about the Zumafication that we've talked about here, that says it's basically narrow because the party's always done this within the alliance. They've always kind of tapped onto a particular leader. So I don't know if you guys want to say something to that. I mean, I think your points were rather that, yes, they may have always supported leaders in the ANC, but with Zuma, that then re-entered, I think Mazibuko was saying that actually entered the Communist Party for the first time, and it factionalized the party internally, and not totally, I mean, but it basically became an internal dynamic where these kind of various debates were no longer allowed to happen. So I don't know if you want to say something about that. And then there's a question about what we can learn. Vish, you have to speak to this. What we can learn from kind of the shift from modernism to postmodernism era, and you know, the question asks about institutional power versus relational, or shifted to relational power. I don't think that's exactly right. I think it's more about kind of the forms of power that this has entailed. So I think that's going to be all the questions we can take. There's been fantastic comments, and I'm assuming that everyone has been reading the comments. So if you have anything else you would like to add, my three panelists, you can. Now I'm going to give you each minute. So Zico, 2 minutes. To respond to all of these, and then this will be your closing comments as well. Zico?
Thanks, Comrade Michelle. Just to add on a few points on this Zuma issue. Remember, when gear began to bite, there were struggles in communities as well as by industrial workers. Strikes, even general strikes by COSATU. I have pointed out earlier on how the party at that moment, I mean, both Comrade Vish and Mazibuko pointed to the period where the party had adopted independent campaigns and all that. Basically, the golden period, if we could call it, the best days of the Blade era. The Zuma moment was a reversal of that. However, unlike Comrade Mazibuko, I wouldn't say that was a counter-revolutionary stand by the party. I think that's true, but it's for debate. But I am clear that the party took a reactionary standpoint. Reactionary in the sense that we were moving forward. Class struggle was intensifying. The party had this popularity, and we were waging even independent campaigns, even against the ANC. Take Khutsong, for example, right? But with Zuma, we threw that away. We bureaucratized the party. We split the trade unions. Look where COSATU is today. So it's a reactionary movement. But whether reactionary or counter-revolutionary, that's a debate. But I'm clear on the fact that in relation to the progress we were making, the Zuma moment took us back. It was reactionary. Then the last point I just want to make is that with this Weimar Republic, I also accept that moment that we are in it's like the Weimar Republic. So with this, the government is weak and strong. The state is weak and strong. I think the last, the recent events around looting and JZ issue have demonstrated that, that something can happen here. So it's either we would have something like, whether it's proto-fascism or whatever, what Comrade Vish and Mazibuko said earlier, or a workers' government, a government of the workers and the poor. Remember Thabo Mbeki at the first special Congress of the party in Durban in 2005. He posed a question to the party in his input. That's the last point. That isn't it that communists now and the working class should be fighting for a workers and peasants government? In the South African context, it can only be a workers and poor people's government, not the so-called democratic state or national democratic society, a government of the workers and the poor. That's what is facing us. Failing which, then a right-wing regime, Pilsudski type, like in Poland. Thank you, Comrade Michelle.
Thanks, Zico. Mazibuko?
I will close by focusing on the questions about citizens, democracy, and the parliamentary route to socialism. Absolutely, Vish is right about the need to distinguish democracy from capitalism and liberalism. I think that is crucial because actually in South Africa and elsewhere in the world, all democratic gains have been won by popular classes, primarily the working class. That's absolutely crucial. And that class content of democracy going forward is still going to depend on the extent to which the working class pushes the envelope, on the extent to which the working class actually stems its agenda on society. So similarly, therefore, the struggle for socialism cannot be narrowed into one that just takes one route, for example, the parliamentary route, as if parliament is the harbinger of all forms of change that are required. I think parliament as a legislature is crucial, but parliament under capitalism will be limited. Therefore, there's a need for an overall strategy that looks at all key sides of power, that looks at the economy, that looks at the side of social reproduction, that looks at political power at all levels. How would socialists approach all of those bases of power, and how would socialists mobilize the working class to have power over those? I think for me, that's the ongoing question. So for example, when it comes to land redistribution, how would socialists approach that question if they were in power, or how do they approach it when they are outside of power in terms of mobilizing the mass forces and so on. So for me, the questions ultimately point to the need to continue to mobilize the mass of society, but also that mass of society to ensure that it expands the realm of democracy in all spheres of life.
Excellent, thanks, Maz. Vish?
Yeah, so I think agreeing with what others have said, we need a constitutive form of class power. And, you know, most postmodern thinkers don't have a clue about what this is about, whether it's Foucault or whoever else. And constitutive class powers, as Mazibuko and to some extent Zico was talking about, is what we build from below, with, against, and beyond the state, whether it's building new food systems to express a form of structural class power, whether we build new kinds of aggregated movements which display movement power, whether we change the kind of legislative framework that deepens our democracy. So we have a constitutionalized form of power and so on. So I think that's for me what's important, is that the resources of Marxism and how it understands power are very, very important where we are. My second quick point is on China. I mean, what is unique about China historically is the alliance between the peasantry and the working class. And the Communist Party in China has always vaunted that alliance and has always tried to keep that class alliance at the center of its political project. China has gone through major transitions, actually, particularly post-Mao. And in many ways, and it's a very complex society, and in many ways, it is an authoritarian state capitalist society. And that worker-peasant alliance is constantly, I would argue, in contradiction and in tension. China cannot be reproduced. There's no China model that we can borrow and cut and paste, even in South Africa, which is what the lazy Communist Party was trying to do, and so on. It's a very specific society with complex accumulation processes, high levels of class struggle and contestation, tensions around the distribution of power between the state and the states, etc. And China is also very, very self-interested. It's not renewing an internationalism post-Bandung, for example. So we need to be cautious about them. My final point is that regarding what we are living through, and I think Zola asked this question, I mentioned social breakdown. But to use a more Marxist language, we are dealing with the manifestations of crisis of a disaster capitalism. That's what we are dealing with.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vish. Wonderful. This is, for me at least, you know, having studied the party. For those of you who don't know, I wrote something on the Communist Party. And actually, Vish, Mazibuko, and Zico were all crucial in my research originally in 2001. But I think this has been fantastic. It's 100 years of the SACP, and I think the future is very uncertain for it. I mean, I think we've discussed, but I think it's uncertain for many organizations, but all of us. I think we're at a turning point in history right now, and I think this discussion has actually highlighted some of these issues. You know, the ecological issue, climate change, we're seeing this now starting. It's no longer something that's going to happen. It's happening. It's destroying lived environments in the global north and the global south. Every year it's getting worse. We have social, political, ecological crises that are kind of fraying us, tearing us apart. You know, this time actually really requires that we bring out the best in humanity, not the worst. And I think that these discussions and debates are really crucial for this, that we find a way to bring out the best of humanity and save ourselves from ourselves. I'd just like to thank the panelists, Zico, Vish, and Mazibuko. It was wonderful hearing you in your different locations, but also your profound reflections on the party. Thank you very much to the panelists. Your questions have been fantastic. There's been lots of discussion and debate, which has been wonderful. But, you know, as with all things, there's a huge amount of work that goes behind the scenes to make anything like this, even a webinar online, happen. And we owe a big thanks to Jane Cherry, but also the entire COPAC team. But you know, Jane, if you ever see all of our DM and EFS and COPAC posters, that's Jane's brilliant doing, but also just always organizing us so well. So thanks very much to Jane and the COPAC team for all your work and support. And I hope everyone has a lovely Sunday evening further. Unlike things, we start on time and we end on time. Zico, since you're still in the party, note that. It is 5 p.m. and goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Mish and Comrade Jane and all the participants, Comrade Vish and Jara. Let's continue to renew. Aman.
Thanks, Zico. Thank you.